The Velderon mapping continuance closed the Kessavar transit gap on a rotation 7 morning, and that was the last official record of anyone caring about it for 11 years. I know this because I was the one who walked into it. Let me back up. I work freight survey. Have for going on 14 years. Sector corridor assessment, primarily. You go out ahead of the cargo routes and you read the terrain, atmospheric variance, surface load bearing, relay marker density, erosion indices. You produce a report. The report gets filed. Somebody decides if the corridor is viable. That's the whole job. It is not a glamorous job. I eat a lot of reconstituted grain paste on a folding table inside a survey canister, while the wind tries to peel the canister off whatever ridge I've anchored it to, and then I write numbers into a transit ledger and atmospheric notation logs until I fall asleep. That is what I do. The Kessavar Gap is a 47-kilometer stretch of surface terrain running between the Velderon primary freight corridor and the secondary resettlement axis. The continuance had it flagged class unnavigable on their charts, since their original survey crew went in on rotation 7 of the 9th development cycle and came back 3/4 short. The ones who came back described conditions they couldn't fully articulate. The report used the phrase directional collapse 4 times, which is a mapping term for, we don't know what's happening in there, but it kept happening, and we stopped looking. They closed the gap. They routed everything the long way, adding 19 days to every resettlement supply run through that corridor. It became background noise, standard operating practice. Nobody filed a route for the sector, because the sector had eaten 4 mapping specialists, and the continuance had decided that was sufficient data. I want to be precise about what I thought when the transit authority at Sci-Fi Station handed me the gap assignment. I thought, 47 kilometers of uncharted surface terrain, 11-year-old adverse condition notation, prior crew losses documented. I also thought, the geological substrate index in the continuance's original survey notes put that terrain at silicate laminate composite, fractured tertiary layer, subsurface thermal differential of 14 degrees, across a 40-meter depth range. I thought those two things simultaneously, and one of them bothered me considerably more than the other. The crew losses, I mean. Not because they were large, because they were unnecessary. I grew up on Lethkara. Lethkara is a Class 53 designation, which means the continuance's threat matrix for it starts at the second-to-last column and doesn't improve from there. It is a planet of silicate laminate composite terrain, fractured tertiary layer, subsurface thermal differential of 14 degrees across a 40-meter depth range. It is also where I learned to walk, where I learned to read surface fracture patterns by the quality of light bending off the crystal-veined rock face at mid-morning, where my father taught me that when the secondary fracture line runs perpendicular to the primary stress axis, you don't walk the floor, you walk the wall, the ledge shelf that forms along the upper fracture boundary, 3 meters off the ground, where the structural load redistributes and the footing holds. The continuance didn't know any of that. Their original survey crew had come from Veldara, which is a Class 7. They had modern instruments. They had directional sensors and atmospheric array systems and ground-penetrating relay equipment. What they didn't have was any reason, in their entire developmental history, to learn how silicate laminate terrain behaves when the thermal differential drops across a fracture seam. The floor collapses, the walls hold, you don't walk the floor. I went into the gap on a Tuesday. I had a transit badge, a ledger, 60 meters of anchor line, and a packet of reconstituted grain paste that I finished before I reached the first fracture boundary. The relay markers were still in there from the original survey. The continuance hadn't pulled them, because pulling them would have required sending someone in. The markers were scored on their lower faces from 11 years of thermal cycling, which told me the fracture activity was periodic, not constant. It also told me the upper ledge shelves were stable. Thermally active terrain doesn't score the tops of pylons. It scores the bases. I read that off the first marker inside the boundary, adjusted my route, and walked the walls. It took me 6 hours and 40 minutes. That's the part I think about when people ask me to explain it. Not the terrain itself, which was difficult but navigable if you knew what to read. Not the 3 places where the ledge shelf narrowed to 30 centimeters, and I moved slowly and put my weight against the rock face and thought about my father's voice telling me the wall always holds longer than you think. Not the relay marker in the gap's midpoint that was still transmitting on its factory default maintenance frequency, which I used to file a preliminary freight amendment from inside the boundary, using my badge's secondary communication partition. 6 hours and 40 minutes. The original survey crew had been in there for 9 days before the incident that reduced them. I filed the full survey report from the gap's far boundary at 1847 hours, including a recommended route notation, a lead shelf load-bearing assessment for standard freight canisters, and a correction to the directional collapse classification. The correct classification, per Val-d'Aran Geological Assessment Code subsection 4, is tertiary fracture active terrain, upper shelf navigable, periodic cycle. There is a form for that. It is not the form the continuance had in the original file. The form they had filed the gap under was designed for atmospheric instability events, which is a different phenomenon with a different behavior profile and a different navigability index entirely. They had used the wrong form for 11 years. I flagged that in the remarks column of the correction filing and went home. The transit authority at Sci-Fi Station sent me a message 4 days later, asking if I had additional documentation of the route, because their cartographic review board was having difficulty processing the amendment. I sent them the full ledger, 63 pages of fracture pattern notation, stress axis readings, thermal differential measurements taken at each relay marker, and a hand-drawn diagram of the lead shelf profile at the 3 narrow points where the navigability was marginal. The board's response came back in 2 parts. The first part was a request for clarification on my survey methodology, specifically how I had determined the upper shelf load-bearing capacity without ground-penetrating relay equipment. I wrote back and explained that I had assessed it by stepping onto each shelf, noting the deflection rate under my body weight, and comparing it to the deflection profiles I had learned to read on Lethkara, over roughly 2 decades of doing exactly that. The second part of the board's response, which arrived 4 days after the first, was a single line that said the board had accepted the route classification amendment and would begin feasibility review for corridor reinstatement, pending standard 19-day review period. They reinstate the corridor 6 weeks later. The resettlement supply runs through the gap now. It saves 19 days per run. The cartographic board filed the route under my name in the continuances corridor registry, which I only know because I received a notification about it and had to look up what it meant. There was one other thing. The board's acceptance notice included an attached document, a note from their senior cartographic assessor, a reptilian Val-d'Aran official named Kessavar, who had been the one to review my methodology clarification. The note said the board had cross-referenced my fracture pattern notation methodology against the continuance's geological assessment training archive. The methodology I had described was not in the archive. It was not in any archive the continuance maintained. It was, Kessavar's note stated, apparently specific to a class of terrain that the continuance had no active survey presence on, because the continuance had no survey teams rated for Class 50 or above. The gap, Kessavar noted, was a Class 53 equivalent terrain feature. The continuance had never classified it that way, because their standard assessment tools did not distinguish between atmospheric instability and tertiary fracture activity at that thermal differential range. If they had classified it correctly at survey, they would have flagged it as requiring a specialist with Class 53 or higher environmental adaptation, of which, Kessavar noted, the continuance had none under contract. The last line of the note read, "We are uncertain how to log the route assessment methodology in our archive, as we have no category for it. We would welcome a brief technical notation from the survey specialist if she is willing to provide one." I wrote one. It was 4 pages. I kept it simple. I don't know if they understood it. But the corridor is open, and the supply runs are moving, and somewhere in the continuance's archive, there is now a folder labeled Lethkara Fracture Pattern Navigation, Class 53 Adapted Methodology, with my name on it, filed under the heading Techniques Not Previously Documented. That felt about right to me.